Thank you also to the ECR for the kind invitation to come here and speak this afternoon. Let me preface what I'm going to say with perhaps a couple of excuses. I'm, a transatlantic person to my bone. My nickname when I went to school in the middle part of Sweden 25 years ago was Iron Curtain. And for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been in the process of working on TTIP, firstly through a transatlantic task force on trade and investment that I convened together with the German Marshall Fund, which led to the working between the White House and the European Commission about setting up TTIP. I'm a firm believer that TTIP is of high importance to Europe, but I don't think it's going to have a huge significant impact on the European economy. I think, in fact, that we are putting a little bit too much emphasis on the capacity of TTIP itself to change things, and we are neglecting far many other things that needs to be done in association with TTIP, hopefully, in order to revive not just European growth, but growth around the world. The notion here is that a trade agreement could substitute for many other faults that exist in the transatlantic firmament, that decades of falling appetite, especially on the part of Europe, to invest in defense, to invest in strategic and military operations that would invite America to have greater trust in collaboration with Europe, that you could escape this by doing a free trade agreement with each other. A lot of people give TTIP a geopolitical type of sort of atmosphere and aura, and we heard at the time of the launch of TTIP that the US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was speaking about it as the creation of an economic NATO, part and parcel of a new strategies in order to deal with not just troubling parts of the world, but also a global economy which isn't working perhaps as much to the benefit of the Americans and Europeans as they were in the past. And of course that notion goes back on a history, a post-war history, when European nations together with America were the large leaders for the global trading system that began to emerge from 1947, when the first GATT rounds of trade negotiations started, and up to our time. It was especially part of sort of America's vision of spreading capitalism and free market democracies around the world, and most European countries were willing to perhaps not lead as much as America did, but at least to be a junior partner of that mission. And then on the back of that mission, we saw a huge expansion of freer trade and trade reforms in the world that open up for new sources of growth and new sources of prosperity, especially for Western countries. We are now in a very different type of atmosphere. To talk about emerging markets, I think is wrong, because most of these countries have already emerged, at least when it comes to the point of having huge political influence on the shape and form of whatever economic policies that will be agreed at the global level in future. We're still talking about China as if they are going to have a huge influence in what we're going to do for the future, but they've already had that for the past 20 years. It has been almost virtually impossible to try to find a way to do deals on trade, finance, or other economic issues around the world without active participation from Beijing. What we've seen in trade policy for the past 15 years soon, after the launch of the Doha Round 2001, is of course a China which has been on the sidelines and not been very happy to take an active participation in negotiating new global free trade agreements. China joined the World Trade Organization they joined the WTO at the same year as the Doha Round was launched. and believed that they had already made all forms of reforms that would come as part of the Doha round when they acceded to the WTO. So they weren't willing to trade and barter different sort of trade liberalizations in the Doha round. And I think that largely killed the entire Doha round for the simple reason that for any practical purposes, for any issue you can think about in real commercial global competition in the world, if China isn't going to put more market access and more openness to its economy on the table, it's going to be impossible to do something with other countries for the simple reason that that country, that economy is far too consequential for companies as well as for other economies to allow it to free ride on a system which is done in the past. For a good time, we didn't really need to care that much about the sort of drainage of leadership for global trade for the simple reason that actual trade in the world expanded far faster than it had ever done in history. So when you go back and look at trade statistics for the past 20 years, you can see that trade expanded faster than it ever done in history before. So why did you need to go through the troubling parts of negotiating free trade agreements when, in reality, global trade seems to be in better shape than ever? And behind that explosion, of course, was the rise of Asia and the rise of other emerging markets as well, but in particular the rise of Asia. I think what is interesting right now is that we find ourselves in a position where the strong economic effects that came from around 1 billion people stepping into the world economy for real, that effect has begun to peter out. That trade isn't expanding as fast now as it did in the past. If you look at the European Union, for instance, our trade with rising Asia is declining. It's not just the growth of the trade which is declining, but actual numbers are declining. And there are a couple of reasons behind that. But one of the reasons is, of course, that we see a huge structural shift in the way that Asian countries are integrating with each other. Exactly like any other country that have developed up to a certain degree, they have begun to change their demand patterns. They don't need as much as before to buy infrastructural goods, capital goods, industrial system goods, which of course a lot of European companies could readily export to them. They don't demand that type of goods as much as they did in the past. Now they begin to demand other types of goods and services, consumer goods, services, etc. And all of them tend to be far more locally produced. For the same, exactly the pattern as you've seen emerge in Europe over the past 50 years, which is that the richer we have become, the more we have started to trade with those that are close to us. Exactly the same pattern you're seeing emerging in Asia right now. And this basically points to a reality for the EU as well as the United States, which is that they need to get into that new type of trade pattern in Asia. If they want to benefit from trade as much in the future as much as they've done in the past, they need to find new ways to step into the actual flows of trade expansion that goes on in the world. And that expansion happens to be in that region. I think TTIP is of critical importance here, not because of the benefits that TTIP are going to deliver to the EU and the United States directly by opening up markets towards each other to a greater degree. I think that the greatest benefit to Europe as well as America and to the rest of the world is the extent to which TTIP can throw new tensions into global trading system that will force other countries to become more amenable to more trade liberalization globally. So it's the structural capacity of TTIP to change the motivation of other countries to participate in more liberalization. That's going to be, for me, the key benchmark for whether TTIP is going to be a success or not. Bilaterally, the direct economic gains that can be derived bilaterally by opening up markets between us, they will be decent, but they are not going to be substantial. They're not going to sort of make a big difference to households or companies in Europe when they are struggling to raise their welfare. But to the extent we can use TTIP as a key building block in order to change the motivations of China, India, Brazil, and many other big emerging powers that already have an influence in world trade policy. If we can do that, then I think TTIP is going to be a success. So that's my first benchmark. Second and lastly, the other benchmark you need to have for each and every trade agreement is the extent to which it is going to revive or enthuse governments to commit to domestic economic reforms, ideally domestic economic liberalization and deregulation, that don't necessarily come as a part of the negotiation package itself, but that come through the sort of the bloodstream or the ideas that you can infuse global trade with. So when you look at the big changes to the way governments have dealt with trade policy or economic policy writ large over the past 50 years, you will see that very few changes have come through negotiation, that they sit at a table with other countries and negotiate market access openness with each other. Most of the reforms come when you have governments that are committed about the benefits to yourself by reforming your own economy, ideally by also opening up your economy to other parts of the world without asking for something in return. So autonomous unilateral reform in a larger context of domestic economic reform that increases competition and openness to innovation and new entrepreneurs. If we can use trade agreements to revive that sort of spirit in economic policy making, then we will see also that TTIP has delivered a second benefit, and that's going to be also the second benchmark I'm going to use when I'm going to evaluate the benefit of TTIP, the extent to which it's going to force other countries, including governments around Europe, to do more economic reforms than they would have done without TTIP. Thank you.